The morning rush at Belmont Café was always chaos dressed in cashmere and press suits. Espresso machines hissed like serpents. Designer bags claimed entire tables. Everyone moved with the choreographed urgency of people who believed their time was worth more than others. The elderly woman stood near the entrance, her worn navy coat buttoned to the collar despite the cafe's warmth. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her posture straight despite the weight of her years. She held a small purse with both hands and waited, patient, polite, nearly invisible. "Excuse me," she said softly to a passing server. "I was wondering if I might sit. All tables are reserved." The owner's voice cut through the ambient noise like glass breaking. Marcus Brennan was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in the kind of calculated casual that cost more than it appeared. He crossed the cafe floor with territorial confidence, his eyes scanning the woman from her sensible shoes to her unfashionable coat. "I see several empty tables," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "Reserved," he repeated louder now. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. "This is an upscale establishment. We have a minimum purchase policy. And honestly, I'm not sure this is the right place for her." He gestured vaguely at her coat, her age, her presence. "For everyone." A woman in yoga pants glanced up from her laptop, then quickly looked away. A businessman adjusted his tie and studied his phone with sudden intensity. The barista wiped the same spot on the counter 3 times. The elderly woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'd like a small coffee, please. And I'm meeting someone." Marcus laughed, a sound without warmth. "Meeting someone, right? Look, maybe you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street. They have a senior discount." He stage whispered the last 2 words, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. She stood there, absorbing the cruelty with a stillness that suggested years of practice. Her fingers tightened around her purse, but her voice remained steady. "I'll wait by the window, if that's acceptable." "Actually, it's not," Marcus said, emboldened by the audience's silence, by the power of his own space, by assumptions that had hardened into certainty. "This isn't a waiting room. So unless you're ordering something substantial, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." What he didn't know was that the woman he'd just embarrassed had spent decades serving this country, and that someone far more powerful than him was about to walk through that door. Earlier that morning, Dorothy Hayes had risen at 5:30, as she had for most of her 73 years. Her apartment was modest but immaculate, a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where children still played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. The furniture was dated but well-maintained. Photographs lined the mantel, but they weren't the kind that demanded attention. They simply existed, documenting a life lived in service rather than spotlight. She prepared her breakfast with the precision of ritual: oatmeal, black tea, half a grapefruit. While the water boiled, she straightened the photograph that sat beside the stove, a young man in military dress blues, his smile broad and proud. Her son, gone now for 12 years, but present in every careful choice she made. Every morning she chose dignity over despair. On the small table by the window sat her coat, the one Marcus would later judge. It had been her husband's, altered to fit her after he passed. The lining was worn soft from decades of wear, but the seams were strong. She wore it because it made her feel less alone, not because she couldn't afford another. As she dressed, she pinned a small lapel pin to her collar, unobtrusive, easily missed. The insignia meant nothing to most people who saw it, but to those who recognized it, it spoke volumes. She wasn't one to broadcast her past, but she wasn't ashamed of it either. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. Handwritten, formal, an invitation phrased as a request. "Would you do me the honor of meeting for coffee? There's something I need to say in person, something long overdue." It was signed by someone she hadn't seen in 32 years, someone whose life she'd changed in ways he'd only recently come to understand. She'd agreed to meet at Belmont Café because he'd suggested it, because it was convenient for him, because after a lifetime of putting others first, she'd forgotten how to do anything else. She checked her reflection one final time. The woman looking back was elderly. Yes, but her eyes were clear and her bearing dignified. She'd spent her entire career being underestimated, working in the background while others took credit, serving without recognition because the work itself mattered more than applause. She didn't come to the cafe for attention. She came to meet someone she hadn't seen in years. When Dorothy returned to her spot near the cafe window, Marcus was already launching into his encore performance. A young employee named Sophia had attempted to bring the elderly woman a glass of water, a small gesture of human decency. Marcus intercepted it. "Did I tell you to do that?" he asked Sophia, his voice sharp. "She's just waiting. She's loitering," Marcus corrected. "And you're encouraging it." He turned back to Dorothy, his confidence growing with each passing moment of silence from the other customers. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see that you can actually pay before you order anything. We've had issues with people coming in, ordering, and then suddenly discovering they've forgotten their wallet." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but a weary recognition. She'd seen this before. Different decade, different face, same ugly assumption. "I have money," she said quietly, opening her purse to reveal a modest wallet. "How much?" Marcus pressed, stepping closer. His voice carried across the cafe, ensuring maximum humiliation. "Because if you're ordering the cheapest thing on the menu and camping out for hours, that's not really how we operate here. This isn't a library." A businessman near the window shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The woman with the laptop closed it slowly, her face flushing with secondhand shame. Still, no one spoke up. The silence was its own kind of violence, an agreement reached without words that this was acceptable, that this woman didn't deserve defense. Sophia stood frozen, her hand still holding the glass of water, tears forming in her eyes. She was young, barely 22, and the weight of her own cowardice was settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. Dorothy checked her watch, an old Timex with a leather band worn soft from years of wear. He was 15 minutes late now. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe the past was better left alone. Maybe this humiliation was just the price of trying to connect, of believing that old debts could be honored, that service mattered even when it went unrecognized. "I'll leave after my coffee," she said, her dignity intact despite everything. "And I won't trouble you further." Marcus smirked, sensing victory. "That's probably for the best. Like I said, there are other places that might be more suitable." He turned away, already dismissing her from his mind, already moving on to more important customers, already confident that this moment would end the way these moments always ended, with the powerless accepting their place and the powerful facing no consequences. He thought this moment would end with her leaving quietly. He was wrong. The cafe door opened. The change in atmosphere was immediate and total. The constant buzz of conversation died, as if someone had flipped a switch. Coffee cups paused mid-sip. Fingers froze over keyboards. Even Marcus, mid-sentence in another dismissive comment to Sophia, went silent. The man who entered wore a military dress uniform, and not just any uniform. For stars gleamed on his shoulders, catching the morning light that streamed through the cafe windows. His posture was ramrod straight, his presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with volume or aggression. He was in his early 50s, his hair steel gray at the temples, his face weathered by years of carrying decisions that most people couldn't imagine making. General David Richardson didn't rush. He didn't need to. The room arranged itself around his presence automatically, people leaning back in their chairs, making space, offering respect that was instinctive rather than conscious. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal placed with precision, but it was his bearing that commanded attention. This was a man accustomed to authority, comfortable with power, certain of his place in the world. His eyes swept the cafe methodically, taking in a frozen tableau, the owner standing too close to an elderly woman, the defensive body language, the guilty silence of the witnesses. A young employee holding a glass of water with tears on her cheeks. Customers studying their screens with sudden intensity. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he saw her. Recognition flashed across his face, followed immediately by something deeper: respect, gratitude, perhaps even love. His entire demeanor shifted, the stern military bearing giving way to something more human, more vulnerable. He crossed the cafe floor with deliberate steps, his shoes marking time against the hardwood. Every eye in the room followed him. Marcus's face had gone from confident to confused to pale in the span of seconds. When he reached Dorothy Hayes, General Richardson came to attention. The movement was crisp, formal, the kind of respect reserved for superior officers or heads of state. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried weight that made Marcus's earlier mockery seem even more grotesque by contrast. It wasn't just a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of respect that rang through the cafe like a bell. Dorothy's face transformed. The careful mask of dignity she'd maintained through the humiliation melted into genuine warmth. Her eyes, which had remained steady through Marcus's cruelty, now glistened with emotion. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness that spoke of years of history. "You made it." "I apologize for being late," Richardson said. And then, before she could protest, before anyone could process what was happening, he did something that made several people in the cafe gasp audibly. He embraced her. Not with the careful distance of a formal greeting, not with the awkward pat of someone fulfilling an obligation, but with the genuine affection of someone greeting family. His arms wrapped around her small frame, and for a moment, the four-star general disappeared, and there was only a man grateful beyond words. When he stepped back, his hands remained on her shoulders for a moment, as if reassuring himself she was real. Then his eyes moved to Marcus, who had gone from pale to ashen. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Is there a problem here?" Richardson asked, his voice quiet but carrying a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. It wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to explain, to justify, to account for what he'd witnessed. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. His confidence had evaporated like steam. "No, sir. General, no problem at all. We were just... You were just what?" Richardson's gaze was steady, unflinching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Command presence wasn't about volume. It was about certainty, about the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "I didn't." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the silence. "I didn't realize..." "Realize what?" Richardson interrupted, his tone sharpening like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "That she deserved basic courtesy? That dignity isn't determined by the cost of someone's coat." He paused, letting the questions land, letting them settle into the consciousness of everyone listening. "Or did you simply not realize who you were speaking to?" The cafe had become a courtroom, and everyone present was both jury and defendant. The businessman by the window had set down his phone entirely, his face flushed with shame. The woman in yoga pants had closed her laptop and was staring at her hands. Sophia was crying openly now, the glass of water still clutched in her trembling fingers. Richardson turned slightly, addressing not just Marcus but the entire room. His voice carried to every corner, ensuring that no one could pretend they hadn't heard, that no one could claim ignorance later. "This woman," he said, and the reverence in his voice was unmistakable, "is Dorothy Hayes. 37 years with the Department of Defense. She started as a file clerk in 1968, barely 20 years old, at a time when women, especially black women, weren't exactly welcomed in government service. She retired in 2005 as a senior logistics coordinator." He paused, looking around the room. "Doesn't sound impressive, does it? File clerk to coordinator. No medals. No headlines. No ticker tape parades." His voice hardened. "But here's what that means. Here's what you didn't know when you judged her based on her coat." Richardson turned back to Dorothy for a moment, and his expression softened with memory. For 3 decades, she was one of the people who made sure soldiers deployed with the equipment they needed. The right supplies, the right support, the right information. While politicians gave speeches and generals got promotions and civilians went about their comfortable lives, Dorothy Hayes worked 70-hour weeks, making sure that someone's son or daughter came home alive. He took a breath, and when he continued, his voice had softened but lost none of its intensity. In 1993, I was a second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, young and stupid and terrified. I was assigned to a deployment that was falling apart before it started. Supply chains were broken. Equipment was missing. Critical gear had been sent to the wrong location. My entire unit, 47 soldiers, was about to head into a hostile situation, dangerously unprepared. He looked at Dorothy, and his expression was completely unguarded now, vulnerable in a way that generals rarely allow themselves to be. This woman worked 72 hours straight to fix it. She rerouted shipments, bypassed bureaucratic delays, called in favors she'd spent years accumulating, and got us what we needed. She broke rules. She risked her career. She did it without asking for anything in return, without expecting recognition or thanks. His voice cracked slightly. She probably saved lives that week. She definitely saved mine. And she did it for a scared kid she'd never met, would probably never see again, because that's what she did. That's what she spent her entire career doing, saving lives in silence. Dorothy's eyes glistened, but she remained composed, her dignity intact even in this moment of recognition. "You were just a boy," she said quietly. "Same age my son would have been." Richardson's expression crumpled for just a second before he composed himself. "I was terrified," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "I had 47 lives depending on me and no idea what I was doing. And you treated me with kindness I didn't deserve. You made calls you weren't supposed to make. You took risks with your career to help someone you'd never met, someone who couldn't do anything for you." He turned back to Marcus, and his voice became steel again. "So when I asked to meet her here today, to finally thank her properly after 3 decades, to finally express gratitude that should have been given years ago, I didn't expect to find her being humiliated in public by someone who couldn't see past his own limited imagination." The silence in the cafe was absolute, suffocating. Someone's phone buzzed, and they fumbled to silence it with shaking hands. Marcus attempted to salvage something from the wreckage. "Sir, General, I had no idea. She didn't say anything about if I'd known." "If you'd known," Richardson repeated, his tone flat and dangerous. "So you're saying you would have treated her differently if you'd known her background? That basic human decency is conditional on someone's resume? That respect is something earned rather than inherent?" Marcus went from pale to red, his face flushing with shame and anger and confusion. "No, that's not. I just meant." "Because I think what you meant," Richardson continued, his voice cutting through the attempted excuse like a knife, "is that you judged this woman based on her appearance, her age, and your own limited imagination about what value looks like. You saw an elderly black woman in an old coat and decided she didn't belong in your upscale cafe. You made that judgment in seconds, and then you made it public. You turned your ignorance into entertainment for your customers." Sophia, the young employee, had tears streaming down her face. She set the glass of water down on a nearby table because her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. The businessman by the window had his head in his hands. The woman in yoga pants was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Dorothy finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with unexpected gentleness. "David, it's all right." "It's not all right," Richardson said, but his tone softened when he looked at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, it's not." She smiled, and it was sad and wise and weary with the kind of knowledge that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated. "I've been dismissed before, by people who assumed that because I was black, because I was a woman, because I didn't have a degree from the right schools or speak the right way or wear the right clothes, that I was less than, that I didn't matter, that I could be ignored or mocked or pushed aside." She paused, looking around the room. "It's not new. It's never been new." She turned to Marcus, and her gaze was clear and steady and somehow still kind despite everything. "But every time it happens, someone gets to make a choice. The person who did wrong gets to decide. Do they learn from it, Or do they just learn to hide it better? Do they examine why they made those assumptions? Or do they just get more careful about who they judge out loud? The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in grace, an opportunity disguised as criticism. Marcus stood there, his world realigning around this new information. His cafe, his kingdom, the space where he was always right and always in control, suddenly felt small and shabby. He was aware, perhaps for the first time, of how everyone was looking at him, not with respect or fear, but with disgust, with pity, with the kind of second-hand shame that makes witnesses uncomfortable. He stopped, his voice failing. Started again. I apologize. Sincerely. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. The words came out mechanical, rehearsed, the kind of apology trained into customer service interactions. To whom are you apologizing? Dorothy asked quietly, and the question was a scalpel cutting to truth. To me, because a general walked through that door, and I suddenly have status you respect? Or to the person you thought I was? To the elderly black woman in the worn coat who you assumed couldn't afford your coffee? It was the kind of question that split reality open, exposing the rot beneath. Because the answer mattered. One response was self-preservation disguised as remorse. The other was genuine accountability, painful and transformative. Marcus's face worked through a series of expressions: confusion, defensiveness, anger, and finally something that might have been the beginning of genuine self-awareness. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter and less certain. To you. To both. I don't. He took a shaky breath, and for the first time, he seemed to actually see Dorothy Hayes as a person rather than an inconvenience. I need to think about what I did. Really think about it. Not just apologize and move on, but actually understand why He couldn't finish the sentence. Richardson watched this exchange with the intense focus of someone assessing whether an answer was authentic or performative, genuine transformation or tactical retreat. After a long moment, he seemed to arrive at a conclusion, though whether it was positive or negative remained unclear. Here's what's going to happen, Richardson said, his tone shifting from condemnation to command, the voice of someone used to giving orders that would be followed without question. Mrs. Hayes and I are going to sit at that table. He pointed to the best seat in the house, a quiet corner with natural light and privacy. We're going to have coffee and conversation for as long as we want, without interruption, without judgment, without anyone making assumptions about whether we belong here. And when we leave, you're going to think very carefully about what happened here today. Yes, sir, Marcus said immediately, the automatic response to authority. I don't want your obedience, Richardson said sharply, and there was frustration in his voice now, the weariness of someone who'd seen too many people respond to rank rather than reason. I want your understanding. Every person who walks through that door deserves basic respect, not because of what they've accomplished or who they know or what uniform they wear, but because they're human, because dignity isn't earned, it's inherent. If you can't learn that, if you can't see people instead of categories, you shouldn't be serving the public. He offered his arm to Dorothy, who took it with a small smile that contained multitudes, gratitude, vindication, and a touch of sadness that this was necessary, that the lesson had to be taught this way. As they walked to the corner table, the cafe remained frozen, everyone processing what they'd witnessed. It wasn't just about Dorothy Hayes or Marcus Brennan or even General Richardson. It was about all of them, about every choice they'd made or failed to make, about every time they'd stayed silent when silence was complicity. Sophia rushed over with menus, her hands shaking so badly the laminated pages rattled. I'm so sorry, she whispered to Dorothy, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and shame. I should have said something. I should have stood up to him. I should have. Dorothy patted her hand gently, and the gesture was infinitely kind. You tried, dear. You brought me water. That took courage in that moment, more than you know. Don't lose that. Don't let this place, or any place, make you someone who stops trying. The young woman nodded, tears falling faster now, and hurried away to get their coffee. As General Richardson and Dorothy settled into their conversation, 32 years of catching up compressed into what would become hours of coffee and shared memories. laughter and grief and recognition long overdue. The cafe slowly resumed its rhythm. But it was different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. The easy confidence of the morning rush had been replaced by something heavier, more uncomfortable. Every person there had been forced to examine their own silences, their own judgments, their own failures to intervene when intervention was needed. The businessman who'd buried himself in his phone. The woman who'd closed her laptop but said nothing. The other customers who'd watched the humiliation unfold like it was entertainment, who'd been grateful it wasn't happening to them. The businessman approached Marcus at the counter 10 minutes later, unable to concentrate on his work, unable to pretend anymore. "I should have said something," he admitted quietly, his voice tight with shame. "I saw what was happening, and I just sat there. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I didn't understand the full situation. But I knew. I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing." Marcus nodded slowly, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm the one who needs to change. But yeah, someone should have said something." He paused, then added, "Thank you for saying something now, even if it's late." The businessman left shortly after, his coffee unfinished. Several other customers did the same, unable to sit in the space where they'd revealed their worst selves, where they'd chosen comfort over courage. That afternoon, Marcus closed the cafe early. He sat alone in the empty space, surrounded by expensive furniture and carefully curated ambience, and thought about what Dorothy Hayes had asked him. Did he learn, or did he just learn to hide it better? The question haunted him for days, then weeks. He started therapy, something he'd always dismissed as unnecessary. He began reading books about unconscious bias, about the history of discrimination he'd never bothered to learn. He had uncomfortable conversations with Sophia and other staff members about times they'd witnessed him make assumptions, show favoritism, treat people differently based on appearance or perceived wealth. The truth was ugly. The pattern was clear. Dorothy Hayes hadn't been an isolated incident. She'd just been the one that got witnessed by someone with the authority to call him out. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus made changes. He instituted a new policy. No staff member could refuse service or seating based on appearance, order size, or assumption about ability to pay. He implemented mandatory training on unconscious bias for all employees, himself included. He created a sliding scale for coffee prices, ensuring that cost would never be a barrier to anyone who needed a warm space and a cup of coffee. Some regular customers complained. They said he was getting too political, that he was making it weird, that they came to Belmont Café to escape these conversations, not have them forced down their throats. Several of his wealthiest regulars stopped coming entirely. But something unexpected happened. New people started showing up. A more diverse crowd. Elderly folks from the neighborhood who'd never felt welcome before, students who couldn't afford the previous price points, veterans who'd seen the stories circulate through military networks. The cafe's character changed, and with it, surprisingly, the revenue increased. Not immediately, but steadily. Sophia was promoted to assistant manager, with a substantial raise and explicit authority to intervene if she saw any form of discrimination. Marcus told her directly, "If you see me doing what I did to Mrs. Hayes, to anyone, you stop me. I'm making you responsible for holding me accountable." She took the responsibility seriously, and there were tense moments over the following months when she called him out, when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when he caught himself making assumptions he'd promised to unlearn. The work was harder than he'd expected. Growth wasn't a decision you made once. It was a practice, daily and demanding. 1 month after the incident, Dorothy Hayes returned to the cafe. She came alone, mid-afternoon, when the rush had died down and the space was quiet. She wore the same navy coat, the same sensible shoes, carried the same small purse. Marcus saw her enter and felt his stomach drop. All the work he'd done, all the changes he'd made, suddenly felt inadequate in the face of the woman he'd humiliated. She ordered a small coffee, the same order that had started everything, and took a seat by the window, the exact spot where she'd stood while he mocked her. Marcus made the coffee himself, carefully, as if the preparation could communicate what words couldn't. He brought it to her table, his hands steady only through force of will. "This is on the house," he said. "Always will be. She looked up at him with those same steady eyes, and he remembered how she'd maintained her dignity even in her worst moment. "I prefer to pay," she said gently but firmly. "I don't need charity. I never did. That was never the problem." He nodded, understanding the distinction immediately. "Of course. I'm sorry. I know you are," she said. And then, after a pause that felt weighted with meaning, "The question is whether you're sorry for what you did or sorry that you got caught. The first leads to change. The second just leads to better hiding." Marcus pulled out the chair across from her. Not sitting yet, not presuming that level of familiarity, but asking permission with a gesture. She nodded slightly, and he sat. "I think about that every day," he admitted. "What you said, about whether I was apologizing to you or to who I thought you were." He looked down at his hands. "The honest answer? That morning, it was because I got caught. Because someone with more power than me made me feel ashamed. But now," he trailed off, searching for words that felt true rather than convenient. "Now," Dorothy prompted, her voice neither kind nor unkind, simply waiting. "Now I'm learning that I can't separate those two people. The woman I thought you were and the woman you actually are, they're both you. They should have both been treated with respect. And the fact that I needed a general to teach me, that is something I have to carry." Dorothy studied him for a long moment, and he forced himself not to look away, to sit with the discomfort of being truly seen. "That's a start," she finally said. "Growth isn't a destination, Mr. Brennan. It's a practice. Some days you'll do better. Some days you'll fail. What matters is whether you keep practicing." She paid for her coffee, exact change from her worn wallet, and left a generous tip for Sophia. As she stood to leave, Marcus stood too. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back, for giving me a chance to, I don't know, to try to be better." "I didn't come back for you," Dorothy said, and there was no cruelty in it, just honesty. "I came back because I refuse to let your judgment take away a place I might want to sit. But I hope you do become better. For the next person. For all the people who walked through that door after me." She left, and Marcus watched her go, understanding that forgiveness wasn't something demanded or automatically granted. It was earned slowly, through consistent action over time, through becoming someone worthy of it. General Richardson stayed in touch with Marcus, surprisingly. Not as punishment, but as mentorship. They met monthly, and Richardson shared stories about the people he'd served with, the logistics coordinators, the supply clerks, the administrative staff, the military spouses, the civilians who kept the machinery running. The invisible infrastructure of service. "The military taught me a lot," Richardson told him during one of these conversations. "Strategy, leadership, how to make decisions under pressure. But Mrs. Hayes taught me something more important, that rank and recognition are poor measures of worth. The people who kept us running, who made sure we had food and water and ammunition and medical supplies, they rarely got medals. They didn't get parades or promotions. But without them, the entire system collapsed. Every general owes his success to 1,000 people whose names he'll never know." He paused, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "That's what you failed to see that morning. You saw an elderly woman in an old coat and decided she had no value. But value isn't visible. Service isn't loud. The most important work often happens in silence, done by people who'll never be thanked." The incident at Belmont Café became a story that spread through the city, then the region, then across social media networks and news outlets hungry for moral clarity in an ambiguous world. Everyone had an opinion. Some saw it as simple justice, a bigot getting his comeuppance. Others saw it as performative shaming, questioning whether public humiliation led to genuine change. Still others debated whether the general had abused his power, whether his intervention was appropriate or itself a form of bullying. But beneath the arguments and hot takes, the story resonated because it touched something universal. It asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Have you ever been judged before speaking? Have you stayed silent when someone else was being mistreated? Have you made assumptions about someone's worth based on their appearance, their age, their clothes, their address? And when confronted with your own prejudice, did you learn, or did you just learn to hide it better? Dorothy herself remained largely unchanged by the attention. She declined nearly every interview request, ignored the social media accounts created in her honor, and continued her quiet life of service. She now volunteered with military families, helping them navigate bureaucratic systems, offering the same grace and competence she'd given throughout her career. When a persistent reporter finally tracked her down at a veteran support event, Dorothy agreed to answer one question. What do you want people to take away from what happened at that cafe? Dorothy was quiet for a moment, considering. We all make judgments, she finally said. That's human. What matters is what we do when we realize we're wrong. Some people double down. Some people change. That's the story. Not what happened to me, but what each person in that cafe chose to do afterward. Whether they examined themselves or just felt momentarily uncomfortable and moved on. The reporter pressed, Do you think Marcus Brennan really changed? I don't know, Dorothy admitted. Time will tell. Change isn't a moment. It's 1,000 small choices made when no one's watching, when there's no social pressure, when it would be easier to slip back into old patterns. Ask me in 5 years. 6 months after the incident, Dorothy and General Richardson met again, this time at a military ceremony where she was finally being recognized, 30 years late, for her contributions to military logistics and soldier welfare. The award was modest, the ceremony small, but Richardson had insisted it happen. Some debts, he believed, should be acknowledged publicly even when they were incurred in silence. The event was held at a local veterans hall, nothing fancy. But the room was filled with former service members, current logistics staff, a few politicians who'd learned about Dorothy's story, and Marcus Brennan, sitting in the back row. Richardson had invited him, not as punishment, but as continuation of the education that began that morning in the cafe. Come see what real service looks like, he'd said. Not the kind that gets headlines, but the kind that makes headlines possible. As Dorothy accepted the commendation, she looked out at the small audience. Veterans of multiple wars, logistics coordinators who understood the weight of her work, family members of soldiers who'd come home because someone like Dorothy had done their job with precision and care. She spoke briefly, uncomfortable with attention, but wanting to honor the moment properly. Respect is not about status, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. It's not about accomplishments or recognition or what uniform you wear or how many stars are on your shoulder. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone who crosses your path and treating them accordingly. That's the service we all owe each other. That's the standard we should hold ourselves to. Not just in moments when we're being watched, but especially in moments when we think no one will notice. She paused, looking around the room. I spent 37 years making sure soldiers had what they needed. But every one of us serves in some capacity. Every one of us has opportunities to see people or to overlook them, to offer dignity or to withhold it, to speak up or stay silent. Those choices matter. They matter more than medals or ceremonies or recognition. They matter because they're what we do when it's inconvenient, when it costs us something, when no one will know except the person we helped. The audience rose in applause, not the polite recognition of a formal event, but genuine appreciation for words that hit deep and true. Marcus Brennan was crying quietly in the back row, not from shame anymore, though that was still there, but from understanding. He was beginning to see what he'd been blind to, that every person carried stories he'd never asked about, that appearance was the least important thing about someone, that his assumptions had been not just wrong, but actively harmful. After the ceremony, he approached Dorothy one final time. She was surrounded by well-wishers, but when she saw him, she excused herself and met him halfway across the room. Thank you, he said simply, for not just calling me out, but calling me forward. For the question you asked me that I'm still trying to answer. She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes fully. There was no guardedness left, no protective distance. That's all any of us can do, Mr. Brennan. Call each other forward. The rest is up to you. As people filed out of the ceremony, conversations bubbled up around them. Veterans sharing their own stories of unseen service. Family members expressing gratitude they'd never properly voiced. Young people asking questions about how to serve without needing recognition. The ripple effects of that morning in the cafe continued spreading, touching lives in ways both large and small. A school district in the next county revised its curriculum on empathy and prejudice after a teacher used Dorothy's story as a teaching moment. A corporate office implemented new bias training after employees recognized their own behavior in Marcus's actions. A church group started a program specifically focused on honoring elderly community members whose contributions had gone unrecognized for decades. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about a cafe. It wasn't even really about Dorothy Hayes or Marcus Brennan or General Richardson. It was about every time someone was judged before speaking. Every time dignity was denied to people who didn't look important. Every time silence enabled cruelty. Every time assumptions hardened into certainty without ever being tested against reality. Every time someone saw a stranger and made snap judgments based on appearance rather than taking the moment to see a human being with a full and complex life. The story spread because it asked uncomfortable questions that everyone had to answer for themselves. Have you ever been that person? The one who made assumptions? Have you been the bystander who watched injustice unfold and did nothing? Have you been the victim of someone else's prejudice, forced to maintain dignity in the face of cruelty? And most importantly, what did you do next? These questions didn't have easy answers. That was the point. Real change doesn't come from simple moral tales where villains are punished and heroes rewarded. It comes from the uncomfortable recognition that most of us have been both Marcus and the silent bystanders, both the person who judges and the person who fails to intervene. Dorothy Hayes understood this. That's why she offered grace alongside accountability. That's why she asked the harder question, not whether Marcus was sorry, but what kind of sorry it was. Not whether he'd been called out, but whether he'd been called forward. A year after the incident, Belmont Café looked physically unchanged. Same furniture, same espresso machine, same large windows letting in natural light. But the atmosphere was different. The clientele was more diverse. Elderly neighbors sitting beside college students, veterans meeting for coffee, families bringing children, people who have felt unwelcome before now claiming the space as their own. The sign behind the register read, "All are welcome here." It sounded trite, the kind of corporate diversity statement that meant nothing. But Marcus had insisted on it, and more importantly, he'd backed it up with policy, with training, with his own continued practice of examining his assumptions before acting on them. He still failed sometimes. Old patterns resurfaced. He caught himself making judgments, saw himself starting to treat customers differently based on appearance. But now he noticed. Now he stopped himself. Now he asked questions instead of jumping to conclusions. Now he apologized when he got it wrong, and he made amends. Growth wasn't a destination. It was a practice. Some days were better than others. Dorothy never became a regular at Belmont Café, but she stopped by occasionally, always ordering her small coffee, always paying, always leaving a generous tip for Sophia. Her presence was a reminder, a benchmark, a living question. Are you still practicing? Are you still learning? Are you becoming someone worthy of forgiveness? Marcus never took her presence for granted. Each time she walked through the door, he felt a mix of gratitude and anxiety, pride in how far he'd come and awareness of how far he still had to go. General Richardson continued his mentorship, expanding it to include other business owners, other community leaders who wanted to examine their own biases and practices. He used his platform and authority to spotlight the kind of service that happened in silence, to honor people like Dorothy Hayes whose contributions had gone unrecognized for too long. The story became something bigger than the people involved. It became a parable, a teaching moment, a catalyst for conversations that were long overdue. It asked people to examine not just their actions but their assumptions, not just their words but their silences, not just their conscious choices but their unconscious patterns. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Respect is not about status. It's not about accomplishments or recognition or what you can prove to the world. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone who crosses your path and treating them accordingly, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when no one's watching, especially when they can't do anything for you in return. That was what Dorothy Hayes had practiced for 73 years. That was what General Richardson had learned from her. That was what Marcus Brennan was still learning, one day at a time, one customer at a time, one choice at a time. The question wasn't what would you do if you knew someone's full story. The question was, how do you treat people when you don't? How do you act when you're certain, no, one more powerful will walk through the door? How do you behave when you think you can get away, with cruelty dressed as policy, with judgment disguised as standards, with discrimination presented as preference? Do you see people, or do you see categories? Do you offer dignity, or do you withhold it based on arbitrary measures of worth? Do you speak up when you witness injustice, or do you study your phone and tell yourself it's not your business? And when you inevitably fail because everyone does, do you learn from it, or do you just learn to hide it better? These are the questions that outlived the incident, that spread farther than the story itself, that changed more than just one cafe in one city. There were questions that everyone had to answer for themselves, questions that didn't allow for easy absolution or comfortable distance. Dorothy Hayes, who'd spent a lifetime serving without recognition, had inadvertently sparked a reckoning, not through anger or demands or force, but through the simple act of maintaining her dignity in the face of humiliation and asking one question that split the world open. Do they learn from it, or do they just learn to hide it better? The answer, as it turned out, depended entirely on whether you were willing to sit with the discomfort of genuine self-examination, to practice the hard work of change even when no one was watching, to become someone worthy of the grace you'd been offered. That was the story, not about a cafe or a confrontation or even justice served, but about what we all do in the aftermath, when the moment has passed and the witnesses have left and we're alone with the person we've revealed ourselves to be. Whether we grow towards something better or just get better at pretending we already are.